It wasn't supposed to be anything more than paperwork, but somewhere between her quiet strength and his decision to stay, something changed neither of them was ready for. Rowan Carter sat in his truck outside Lincoln High School on a Tuesday morning in late October, staring at the work order on his dashboard like it might somehow rewrite itself if he waited long enough. And honestly, he was running the math in his head about how fast he could get in and out of this place because his entire job had turned into listening to people inflate damages like they were negotiating for a used car. 35 years old, insurance claims adjuster contracted through the school district's property carrier. Single dad to a 7-year-old daughter named Lily, who asked too many questions he didn't have good answers for, and he'd spent the last 6 years sitting across from homeowners and business managers who looked him dead in the eye and called a scratch a crater. The work order said storm damage to the auditorium. Roof leak during last week's storm, filed through the district office but forwarded to the drama teacher named Khloe Brennan, since she had the most direct knowledge of the damage and held all the receipts, and Rowan grabbed his clipboard and his digital camera and walked across the parking lot, already rehearsing the conversation in his head where someone was going to tell him the entire building was basically condemned, when really it was probably just some water stains and hurt feelings. The auditorium was freezing inside, that specific kind of cold that happens when a building's been sitting empty and damp for days, and the smell hit him first: mildew and wet carpet and something else, maybe paint or wood stain. And when Rowan pushed through the double doors, he saw her immediately. Khloe Brennan was standing center stage under work lights that made the whole space look like some kind of sad theatrical crime scene, surrounded by piles of ruined plywood and what looked like pieces of a castle set that had melted in the rain. And she wasn't on her phone, wasn't pacing around trying to look busy. She was just standing there with her arms crossed, staring up at the ceiling like she was trying to will it to explain itself. She looked exhausted in a way that didn't come from one bad week, the kind of tired that lives in your shoulders and the corners of your eyes. Dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that had given up halfway through the day, paint stains on her jeans that weren't fresh, and when she finally noticed him walking down the center aisle, she didn't smile or put on the customer service voice. She just watched him approach like she was bracing for bad news. Rowan stopped at the edge of the stage and held up his badge even though she clearly knew why he was there. Rowan Carter, District Property Claims. I'm here about the roof damage from last Tuesday's storm. His voice came out flat, professional, the same tone he'd used 200 times this year. And Khloe nodded once and crouched down to grab a cardboard file box that was sitting on a folding chair. And when she stood back up, he noticed her hands, paint under her nails, cuts on her knuckles like she'd been pulling nails out of wood bare-handed, and she set the box down on the stage floor between them without making eye contact yet. I'm not going to waste your time, so here's everything up front, Khloe said, and her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. Not anger exactly, more like someone who'd already decided this wasn't going to go well, but was going to be honest anyway. She pulled out a stack of receipts that were damp around the edges and held together with a binder clip. The roof started leaking around 9 p.m. last Tuesday during the storm, right above the stage. It destroyed the set my students built for our fall production. That's 3 weeks of after-school work. All the plywood's warped, the paint's ruined. The structural beams for the castle backdrop are split from the water weight. She handed him the receipts and he took them, flipping through while she kept talking. I've got $2,200 in material costs. Every receipt's in there. I didn't pad anything. Didn't add extra. This is just what we actually spent. And I'm not going to sit here and pretend it's more than it is, because these kids work too hard for me to turn their work into some insurance scam. Rowan looked up from the receipts and really saw her for the first time, and something in his chest that had been locked down for months cracked just slightly because he'd been expecting the usual dance, the strategic tears, or the aggressive demands, or the carefully rehearsed story with numbers that didn't add up. But this woman was just standing there being brutally, almost aggressively honest, and he didn't know what to do with that. He glanced past her at the destroyed set pieces, saw where she'd already started trying to salvage things, sorted the ruined wood from the maybe usable wood, saw a kid's drawing taped to the wall that said, "Thank you, Ms. Brennan," with a heart, and Rowan set his clipboard down on the stage and pulled out his flashlight. Can you show me where the leak started? I need to document the water line and check if there's structural compromise to the ceiling grid. Khloe climbed the rickety stage stairs and Rowan followed, and she walked him through the whole space, pointing out the water damage without embellishing. Just facts. This is where it came through heaviest. This beam's split here. You can see the water line on the back wall. And Rowan took photos and made notes, and the whole time he kept waiting for her to slip, to add some detail that didn't track, but she didn't. They spent close to 2 hours up there, and she answered every question directly, admitted when she didn't know something instead of guessing, and when he asked if any school equipment got damaged, she said 2 stage lights shorted out, but those were already on their last legs. I'm not claiming those. That's not storm damage. That's just old equipment finally giving up. When they finally came back down off the stage, Rowan leaned against the front row seats, making final notes on his clipboard before he'd lose the details, and Khloe sat on the floor a few feet away with her back against a stack of salvaged plywood, and the silence wasn't uncomfortable exactly, just heavy. Rowan clicked his pen a few times, a habit he'd picked up from years of these site visits, and he didn't look at her when he said, "You know, most people would have rounded that number up, added some emotional distress or educational impact clause. I had a facilities manager last month try to claim a gymnasium floor buckled from a burst pipe when the maintenance log showed the floor had been warped for 2 years before the pipe ever went." Khloe let out this short laugh that wasn't really a laugh, more like acknowledgement that the world was ridiculous. "Yeah, well, I'm not most people. I teach 17-year-olds about integrity and showing up even when things are hard. Can't really do that if I'm lying on insurance forms. Besides, these kids already got screwed once when the roof failed. I'm not going to screw them twice by making this about me getting a payout I didn't earn." Rowan stopped writing and looked at her. Actually looked, and the cynicism that had been his default setting for years just completely dissolved for a second, because when was the last time someone had trusted him to just do his job without trying to manipulate the system, without treating him like an obstacle to get around? "I'll get this processed by end of week. I'm going to document everything I can and make the strongest case possible for the structural classification, but the final decision goes through the review team. Not me. I'll flag it as educational priority and push it through as fast as I can," he said, and Khloe's whole face shifted. Not quite hope, but something close, like maybe the fight she'd been bracing for wasn't coming after all. "Thank you, seriously. The play's in 6 weeks, and I've got 16 kids who've been coming in every day after school asking if we're canceling. I just need to be able to tell them something real." Rowan packed up his gear and headed for the doors, but halfway up the aisle he stopped and turned back, and Khloe was still sitting there on the floor surrounded by the ruins of 3 weeks of student work, and she looked so damn tired, but she wasn't crying, wasn't falling apart. She was just sitting there dealing with it, and something in him shifted. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was being managed or manipulated or played. He felt like he was being trusted, and that feeling followed him all the way to his truck, stayed with him through the drive back to the office, sat next to him while he uploaded the photos and filled out the claim report. And when he got home that night and Lily asked him how work was, he said, "Actually had a good site visit today," and realized he meant it. She was used to doing everything alone, and he was used to people lying to his face, but somewhere in that cold auditorium, something had cracked open in both of them, and neither of them had any idea yet that this wasn't going to be the last time they saw each other. Rowan told himself he was just being thorough when he showed up at Lincoln High the following Monday during his lunch break, and technically he was. His supervisor had flagged the report for additional ceiling grid documentation before it could go to structural review, so he did have a legitimate reason to go back, even if he'd volunteered for the assignment faster than he normally would have. But the truth was, he'd been thinking about Khloe Brennan's face when she handed him those receipts all weekend, and he wanted to make sure this claim actually went through. He found her in the auditorium again, this time with 5 students helping her move the destroyed set pieces into a dumpster outside, and when she saw him walk in, she wiped sweat off her forehead with her sleeve and said, "You're back. Did I forget to sign something?" Her voice had this edge of worry, like she was expecting him to tell her the whole thing was denied already, and Rowan shook his head and held up his tape measure. "Just need to verify some measurements for the report. making sure I didn't miss anything that could get this flagged during review. What he didn't say was that he'd spent 3 hours Sunday night reading through educational facility provisions, making sure he hadn't missed any damage categories that should be included in the assessment, because misclassifying damage in either direction was sloppy work, and he didn't do sloppy work. They ended up in the school's tiny teacher's lounge around noon because Khloe needed coffee and Rowan needed to show her the policy clauses he'd found, and the coffee was absolutely terrible. That specific burnt flavor that comes from a pot that's been sitting on the burner since 6 in the morning, but they both drank it anyway while Rowan spread out printouts of building codes on the table between them. So here's the thing. If we can prove the roof leak caused structural instability to the ceiling grid, not just cosmetic water damage, the payout jumps from basic materials reimbursement to full structural repair, which means instead of just covering your material costs, you're looking at closer to $8,000 because they have to account for structural repair, safety compliance inspection, and contractor labor. Khloe stared at the papers like they were written in another language, then looked up at him with this expression that was halfway between grateful and confused. Why are you doing this? I mean, I appreciate it, but this is way beyond just filing a standard claim. You don't even know me. Rowan stirred his coffee, even though he hadn't added anything to it, buying himself a second to figure out how to answer that. Honestly, I've been doing this job for 6 years, and I'm so used to people trying to game the system that when someone's actually straight with me, it feels like I should return the favor, plus my daughter's 7. And if her teacher was dealing with this, I'd want someone to actually give a damn instead of just checking boxes. That was the first time Khloe smiled at him. Not a polite customer service smile, but a real one that reached her eyes and made her look about 5 years younger, and she told him about her students, about the kid who'd never spoken in class until he auditioned for the play, about the girl whose parents were going through a divorce, who stayed after rehearsal just to have somewhere to be, and Rowan told her about Lily, about single parenting after his ex-wife had relocated to Arizona 3 years ago, and after a custody agreement that wasn't pretty for anyone involved, he'd ended up as Lily's primary parent, full custody on paper, every other school break for her mom, and a lot of questions he still didn't have answers for. They talked through his entire lunch break, and he didn't realize how long they'd been sitting there until another teacher came in and gave Khloe a look that very clearly said, "Who's this, and why does he keep showing up?" And Rowan checked his watch and realized he was 20 minutes late getting back to the office. The next 2 weeks turned into a routine Rowan definitely hadn't planned on. He'd swing by the school during lunch with updates on the claim process. They'd drink terrible coffee, and he'd explain whatever bureaucratic nightmare he was navigating that day. And Khloe would tell him about her students, or show him the progress they were making on salvaging what they could. He learned she'd been teaching for 8 years and spent half her salary on classroom supplies because the school's arts budget was basically non-existent. Learned. She lived alone in a studio apartment, and her family was back in Ohio, but they didn't talk much. Learned she had this way of seeing the best in people that probably should have made her naive, but somehow just made her stronger. She learned he'd studied civil engineering before switching to insurance work because the pay was steadier when Lily was born. Learned he coached his daughter's soccer team, even though he didn't know anything about soccer. Learned he had this dry sense of humor that snuck up on you when you weren't expecting it. 3 weeks after his initial site visit, Rowan got a call from his supervisor at 4:30 on a Friday afternoon, telling him the structural review team had come back with a denial, and the formal letter was already going out to the district office by certified mail. The roof leak had been classified as pre-existing maintenance failure, not covered under storm damage provisions. The water intrusion was due to deferred facility upkeep, which fell under the school district's responsibility. Claim denied. Payout zero. Case closed. Rowan asked his supervisor to send over the written determination and sat staring at it, trying to find a loophole or an appeal path, and came up empty. And he sat there in his cubicle under the fluorescent lights that buzzed just slightly too loud, staring at his keyboard, trying to figure out how he was going to tell Khloe that the system had failed her exactly the way she'd probably expected it to from the beginning. He called the main school number, but it went to voicemail. Tried Khloe's direct line, which he had on file from the claim paperwork, and got the same thing. He sat in the parking lot at his brother's place, trying to decide if texting was too cold for news. This bad. Lily in the back seat working on homework with a flashlight because the dome light was burnt out and he kept forgetting to replace it. Finally, he just typed it out. Kept it factual because putting emotions into it would make it worse. Got the decision from corporate today. They denied the claim, classified the roof issue as maintenance, not storm damage. I'm sorry, I tried everything I could find. He stared at the message for a full minute before hitting send, and the read receipt showed up almost immediately, but no response came, and that silence felt heavier than any argument would have. Saturday morning, his phone buzzed while he was making Lily pancakes, and he grabbed it, expecting maybe a work email, but it was Khloe, just one line. I shouldn't have believed this would work. I'll handle it. The words were polite, almost formal, and that's how he knew she was hurt, and he typed back, "Can we talk about this?" But the message just sat there unread, no reply, and he felt something sink in his chest that had nothing to do with work anymore. He tried calling during Lily's soccer game that afternoon, but it went straight to voicemail. Tried again Sunday morning and got the same thing. And by Sunday night, he'd accepted that she'd shut him out completely, and maybe that was fair. Maybe he'd let her believe the system could work when he should have known better. Monday evening, Rowan was driving home from a site visit on the north side with Lily half asleep in the back. One of those gray October evenings where it gets dark too early and everything looks washed out. And he wasn't planning to drive past Lincoln High, but somehow that's the route he took. The building was mostly dark except for the auditorium, those big industrial work lights blazing, and Rowan slowed down without really deciding to, pulled into the parking lot telling himself he was just checking if her car was there. It was, parked in the teacher's lot near the side entrance, and the auditorium's side emergency exit was propped open with a brick, and through it he could hear the sound of wood being dragged across the stage floor, and see the work lights blazing inside. And when he got out of the truck and stood near the doorway, he could see Khloe up on the stage completely alone, trying to muscle sheets of plywood into position by herself. She'd look like she was managing, and then the board would slip, and she'd have to start over, and even from the doorway he could see how exhausted she was, the way she'd stop and press her palms against her knees to catch her breath before going again. Rowan stood in the doorway, watching her struggle with a crowbar, trying to pry apart two pieces of warped wood that were stuck together, and she finally got them separated, but the force of it sent her backwards and she barely caught herself, and that's when Lily's voice came from beside him, small and confused in the dark. "Dad, why does that lady look like she's trying not to cry?" Rowan looked down and saw Lily had climbed out of the truck and was standing beside him in the doorway, staring up at the stage, and he didn't have an answer that made sense, so he just stood there with his hand resting on her shoulder while the work lights blazed inside. Lily was quiet for a second, then said, "Is that the teacher you've been helping? The one with the play?" And Rowan nodded, throat tight. "Are you going to go help her? She looks like she needs help." The question hung there in the cold air between them, and Rowan looked back through the doorway, watched Khloe dragging another board across the stage, her whole body leaning into it, and every instinct he had that had been built on cynicism and keeping professional distance was screaming at him to just turn around and walk away, but he couldn't make himself do it. He stood there for another 2 minutes, watching Khloe work alone in that cold auditorium, and the image burned itself into his brain, the way she kept going, even though she was clearly exhausted, the way she'd stop and stare at the pile of ruined materials like she was calculating if this was even possible, the stubborn set of her shoulders that said she was going to try anyway. Rowan crouched down to Lily's level, and she said, "Are we going in?" But he shook his head. "Not tonight, sweetheart, but yeah, we're going to help, just not like this." He pulled out of the parking lot, and the whole drive home he was making a list in his head, tools he had in the garage, materials he could pick up from the hardware store, what time he could get there Saturday morning before she showed up, because corporate might have denied the claim, and he couldn't change policy, but he could absolutely show up with a nail gun and 2 hands. And somewhere between the parking lot and his driveway, Rowan Carter stopped being just a claims adjuster, doing his job, and became someone who wasn't going to let her do this alone. Saturday morning came in cold and gray, one of those late October days where the sun doesn't really commit, and everything smells like rain that hasn't fallen yet, and Rowan was loading his truck at 6:15 in the morning while Lily ate cereal on the tailgate, asking questions he was only half answering. He'd raided his garage for everything useful: a pneumatic nail gun his brother had left at his place 2 years ago, an air compressor that still worked, his cordless drill with 2 batteries, a circular saw, work gloves, safety glasses, and he'd stopped at the hardware store the night before and dropped $600 on lumber, the kind of 2x4s that were straight and clean, not the warped garbage they probably had budget for at the school. Lily watched him organize everything in the truck bed with bungee cords and asked, "Are we building something for the sad teacher?" And Rowan tightened down a strap and said, "Yeah, Bug, we're gonna help fix her stage." Lily went quiet for a second, then said, "Is she gonna be your girlfriend?" With the blunt curiosity only a 7-year-old can pull off, and Rowan felt heat crawl up his neck. "No, I'm just helping someone who needs it. That's what you do when people are struggling. You show up." They got to Lincoln High at 7:30, and Khloe's car was already in the parking lot. That same beat-up Honda she drove to school every day, which didn't surprise him at all. She'd cleared the volunteer work with the principal Friday afternoon, got a weekend facilities use form signed, and the district's facilities coordinator had okayed volunteer labor as long as no structural systems were touched. Rowan pushed through the auditorium's heavy double doors, and the sound echoed through the empty space, that specific metallic groan old school buildings make. The temperature inside was maybe 5 degrees warmer than outside, and he could see his breath in the air under the work lights, and Khloe was on stage exactly where he'd seen her Monday night, kneeling next to a pile of salvaged wood with a manual handsaw trying to cut through a warped board. She looked up when she heard the doors, squinting against the light coming in behind him, and her whole body went still when she recognized him standing there in his work jeans and a flannel jacket with Lily next to him, bundling tools. Rowan didn't wait for her to say anything, just walked down the center aisle with his arms full of equipment, boots heavy on the old floor, and set everything down at the base of the stage with more noise than necessary, the air compressor landing with a solid thunk that rang through the space. Khloe stood up slow, still holding the handsaw, and her face was doing this complicated thing where relief and pride were fighting for control, and she opened her mouth twice before actual words came out. "Rowan, what are you doing here? I told you I'd handle this." Her voice tried for firm, but came out shaky, and he could see her knuckles were torn up from pulling nails all week, could see the exhaustion living in the dark circles under her eyes, and he started uncoiling the air compressor hose without looking directly at her, because if he met her eyes right now, she might actually send him away, and he wasn't giving her that option. "Yeah, you said you'd handle it, and I'm sure you would. Probably kill yourself doing it, but you'd get it done," Rowan said, connecting the hose to the compressor with practiced movements, checking the pressure gauge out of habit. "But I spent 3 days thinking about you up here alone, trying to rebuild this whole thing with hand tools and determination, and I couldn't do it. Couldn't just sit at home knowing you were doing this by yourself when I've got a garage full of equipment and a Saturday with nothing better planned." He finally looked up at her, and she was gripping that saw so tight her fingers were white. "The insurance company failed you. The system failed you. I can't fix that. Can't change policy or override corporate. But I'm not going to let you carry this alone when I can actually do something that matters." Khloe's face crumpled for just a second before she got control of it, and she set the saw down on a piece of plywood and wiped her hands on her jeans, even though they weren't dirty, just buying time to compose herself. "I can't pay you. The school doesn't have budget for contractors, and I definitely don't have money to hire help." Rowan was already climbing the stage stairs with his drill and a box of 3-inch screws. "Good thing I'm not a contractor then. I'm just some guy who knows which end of a nail gun is dangerous. Now you gonna show me the plans for this stage rebuild, or are we winging it?" Lily had climbed up behind him and was standing near the edge of the stage, looking at all the destroyed set pieces with open curiosity, and Khloe looked at this man who'd shown up with tools and his daughter on a Saturday morning to fix a problem that wasn't his responsibility, and something in her posture finally gave way. They worked for 11 hours that day, with one break for pizza that Rowan ordered and refused to let Khloe pay for. And it turned out she had actual blueprints, detailed plans she'd drawn up with measurements and material lists. And Rowan realized pretty quick she knew what she was doing, had probably built half the sets in this auditorium over the years. She'd sketch out what she needed, and he'd cut it. She'd hold boards in place, and he'd secure them. And they developed this rhythm that didn't need much talking, just the sound of the compressor running and the nail gun firing, and classic rock playing low from her phone speaker. Lily spent the morning organizing screws and bringing them water bottles and drawing pictures of the stage on the back of ruined posters until Rowan's brother picked her up at noon, and around 2 in the afternoon, when Khloe was up on a ladder and Rowan was bracing a support beam, he said, "Your students are lucky to have you. Most teachers would have just canceled the show and moved on." Khloe didn't look down from what she was doing, but her voice came out quieter. "These kids need to see that when things fall apart, you don't just give up, you get creative and you keep going. I can't teach them that, and then bail the second it gets hard." They came back Sunday and got the main stage platform rebuilt, came back the following Saturday and framed out the castle backdrop, and somewhere in those long days of sawdust and sore muscles, they stopped being the insurance adjuster and the teacher, and just became two people who worked well together. Rowan learned she was funny in this understated way that caught him off guard, learned she could handle a circular saw better than half the guys he'd worked construction with in college, learned she always brought extra coffee and remembered he took his black. Khloe learned he was patient in a way that came from years of single parenting, learned he had this careful precision with measurements that made sense for someone who'd studied engineering, learned he listened more than he talked, and that the quiet between them wasn't uncomfortable, it was just space to breathe. The students started showing up the third week when word got around that their teacher was there every weekend, and suddenly Rowan had a crew of teenagers handing him tools and asking questions about load-bearing structures. And Lily, when she was there in the mornings, had charmed a whole group of high schoolers into teaching her theater games during water breaks. One kid, tall, gangly sophomore named Tyler, muttered something to the kid next to him about whether Rowan was Miss Brennan's boyfriend, not quite quiet enough, and Khloe heard every word of it, and chose not to take the bait, just told him to grab the other end of the board and help carry it, and Tyler did what he was told without pushing it further. By mid-November, the stage was done, better than it had been before actually, structurally sound and level and built to last, and the students had painted new backdrops and rebuilt the props, and Khloe stood in the center of it on a Tuesday evening after rehearsal, just looking around like she couldn't quite believe it was real. Rowan was packing up his tools in the wings, getting ready to head out and pick up Lily from his brother's place, and Khloe walked over and just stood there for a second before saying, "I don't know how to thank you for this. You gave up every weekend for a month, and I know that's time you could have spent with Lily, and you didn't have to do any of it." Rowan zipped up his tool bag and straightened up, and for the first time in 2 months of working side by side, he let himself really look at her, and what he saw wasn't the exhausted, overwhelmed teacher from that first day. It was someone who'd fought for something that mattered and won. "You don't have to thank me. Watching you refuse to give up, even when the system screwed you over, that reminded me why I got into this work in the first place. Somewhere along the way, I forgot it was supposed to be about helping people, not just processing claims, so if anything, I should be thanking you." Khloe handed him 2 opening night tickets and said Lily should see what she helped build, and Rowan tucked them into his jacket pocket without arguing. Opening night was the second Friday in December, and the auditorium was packed. Parents and students and teachers filling every seat, and Rowan sat in the 4th row with Lily in the seat beside him, and she kept standing up to see over the tall guy in front until he pulled her back down, and right before the lights went down, Khloe appeared from backstage long enough to lean down to him quickly, hair down for once, wearing actual nice clothes instead of paint-covered jeans, and she looked nervous in a way he'd never seen her. "What if something breaks? What if the backdrop falls? What if the lights short out again?" she whispered, and Rowan looked up at her. "Then we'll fix it. That's what we do now. We fix things." She squeezed his shoulder once and disappeared back into the wings where she'd watched the whole show from. The house lights dropped and the stage lights came up, and the show was incredible. These kids who'd spent months rebuilding their production from literal ruins, absolutely crushing every scene. And when the final curtain fell, the audience was on their feet. After the crowd cleared out and the students were celebrating in the lobby, Rowan was still in his fourth row seat when Khloe finally came out from the wings and dropped into the empty seat beside him, and they both stared at the stage with this expression of quiet disbelief, and neither of them said anything for a while. Just the sound of muffled celebration from the hallway and the cooling tick of the stage lights. And finally, Khloe said, "I was so angry when that claim got denied. Felt like the universe was just confirming what I already suspected, that nothing works the way it's supposed to, and you can't trust systems to care." She turned to look at him, and her eyes were wet, but she was smiling. "But then you showed up, and you didn't fix the insurance problem. You're right, you couldn't, but you fixed the actual problem. The thing that mattered. And I don't think I've ever had someone just show up like that." Rowan's throat felt tight, and he didn't trust his voice to come out steady, so he just reached over and took her hand, and she laced her fingers through his and leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat there in the empty auditorium, surrounded by the proof that sometimes the right thing matters more than the easy thing. Maybe it wasn't about fixing everything, about making systems work, or getting policies to bend, or having all the answers. Maybe it was just about staying when walking away would have been simpler, about choosing to show up even when you weren't obligated to, about building something real in the ruins of what broke. Rowan couldn't change the insurance denial, and Khloe couldn't rebuild the stage alone, but together, with sawdust in their hair, and too much bad coffee, and a 7-year-old organizing screws, they'd built something that didn't need to be perfect to matter. Somewhere between shared silence and tired hands and small moments. No one else would have noticed. They'd built something that was going to last long after opening night, and neither of them was ready to walk away from that.